The kitchen was filled with the usual hum of family chatter, clinking silverware, the sizzling of food on the stove, and the faint sound of laughter spilling from the living room. It was a Sunday afternoon, and for once, the family had gathered together for a casual meal, a rare occurrence these days. My parents, still managing to stay afloat in their aging house, were hosting yet another family get-together. My older brother, Brian, was perched at the head of the table, effortlessly charming everyone with stories of his latest business triumphs. And there I was, the invisible one, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, trying not to draw attention to myself. Brian had always been the golden child. Everyone knew it, including me. Growing up, I watched as my parents practically bowed down to him. He was the firstborn, the one who excelled in every way they imagined their child should. Perfect grades, star athlete, the kid who could charm anyone into doing anything. He had it all, the praise, the scholarships, the adoration. My parents couldn't get enough of him, often showering him with gifts, compliments, and endless opportunities. He was their pride and joy. And then there was me. The quiet one. The one who tried but never measured up. I remember, as a kid, sitting at the dinner table, trying desperately to get my parents' attention. I'd share a small victory, like passing an exam or getting an art project into the school exhibition, but those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by Brian's latest athletic success or his new accolade. I learned quickly that it was better to stay in the background, where the spotlight wouldn't reveal just how little I mattered in their eyes. This Sunday felt like every other Sunday. Brian's recent business venture had taken off, and my parents were practically glowing with pride. As always, he was the center of attention, drawing admiration from everyone in the room. They couldn't get enough of him, his accomplishments, his charm, his success. As my mother gushed about how proud she was of him, my father couldn't stop himself from bragging about Brian's latest promotion, a deal that was apparently going to make him millions. I could feel the weight of their words pressing down on me, the familiar sting of being overlooked. I sat there, pushing food around on my plate, listening to the symphony of praise for Brian. I had nothing new to contribute, nothing that would make them look at me the way they looked at him. And that was fine. It had always been fine, or so I told myself. After all, what was there to say? I had no fancy title to announce, no big promotion, no recent achievement worth mentioning. I was just me. The one who didn't quite fit the mold. But then, as if to make the divide even more apparent, my mom turned to me with a tight-lipped smile. "How's work going, honey?" she asked, her voice sweet but devoid of real interest. I could tell that, just like always, she wasn't really listening. She was just being polite. "Fine," I replied, glancing up from my plate, meeting her eyes for the briefest moment before looking away. "Same as usual." A soft, awkward silence followed. I could feel the weight of my answer hanging in the air, and I knew Brian would pick up on it. Sure enough, he flashed a knowing grin across the table. "Same as usual, huh? Sounds like you need a change," Brian said, his tone light, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Maybe you should think about finding a new job, get out of that rut. You know, life's too short to just coast along." I couldn't even bring myself to respond. I wasn't in a rut. I was just there. I'd never been the kind of person to chase after titles or accolades. But that wasn't enough for my family. It never had been. And that's when it hit me, in that quiet moment of being overlooked. I wasn't just invisible in this room, I was invisible in this family. The golden child would always shine brighter, always be the one to receive the praise, the attention, the love. And I was the one left behind, caught in the shadows of his success. As I watched my parents fawn over Brian, I couldn't help but wonder, could things ever change? Would they ever see me for more than just the background noise in their picture-perfect family? Or was I doomed to remain the invisible one forever? As the afternoon wore on, I found myself growing increasingly restless. The chatter around me became a blur, each word mixing into the next, drowning out anything that wasn't about Brian's latest triumph. The more I tried to focus on my food, the more my mind wandered to the nagging question I had long been afraid to ask: Why does he always get to be the one everyone praises? I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, adjusting the way I held my fork, anything to distract myself from the weight of the conversation. My parents had always been quick to smooth things over with Brian, often making excuses for his behavior, as though he could do no wrong. It wasn't just the constant praise, it was the way they ignored my presence whenever he was around. They didn't need to say it aloud, their actions made it painfully clear. My childhood was littered with moments where my achievements were brushed aside or minimized. It was as if I wasn't even on their radar unless they needed me for something. I had long since learned to accept my place in this dynamic, or so I thought. But there were days like today when the bitterness crept up on me, uninvited, pushing through the cracks of my well-practiced indifference. I knew the pattern. Brian would impress everyone, and I would silently retreat into the background, the good little child who never asked for more than a scrap of attention. "Mom, did you hear about that new house I'm looking at?" Brian's voice cut through my thoughts, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I was imagining the way my mother's eyes sparkled at the mention of the new home. She nodded eagerly, leaning forward with that familiar, radiant smile she always gave him. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You deserve something nice. You've worked so hard. It's about time you had a place to call your own." Her words made me want to choke. "You deserve something nice. You've worked so hard." The words were meant for Brian, but they stung like a slap in the face. I couldn't help but think of all the things I'd worked hard for, trying to make a name for myself, finding small successes here and there. But none of it mattered. It was always about Brian. Always. A small voice inside my head tried to reason with me, "Don't let this get to you. It's just another Sunday. Just get through it." But it wasn't that simple. The cracks that had been forming for years were starting to show, and today, the pressure was unbearable. "I'm happy for you, Brian," I said, forcing the words out, barely hearing the tone in my own voice. The fake enthusiasm was thin, stretched too thin to be believable. "It sounds like a great opportunity." I couldn't stop myself from glancing at my father, hoping for some kind of acknowledgement, some small recognition of my presence, even if it was just a simple nod. But he was busy scanning Brian's phone, showing him the latest updates on his business venture, no doubt another one of Brian's shining accomplishments. Not once did he meet my eyes. The moment stretched on, suffocating. I felt small, insignificant, like an afterthought. I tried to smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. Instead, I stared at my plate, trying to push the overwhelming sense of resentment and jealousy back down. And then came the unexpected moment that broke through the surface of my carefully constructed indifference. "I think I have something for you, too, sweetie," my mother suddenly said, turning toward me. I blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sudden shift in focus. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope, her smile stretched just a little too wide, as if she was overcompensating. "I've been meaning to give this to you for a while." My heart skipped a beat. A gift? For me? This was rare. And yet, despite the surprise, a chill ran down my spine. What did this really mean? Was it an attempt to smooth over the tension that had been simmering for years, or was this just another token to make it seem like she cared? I slowly took the envelope from her, trying to read her expression. Her eyes were wide with anticipation, but there was something in her gaze that I couldn't quite place. She seemed almost anxious. Was this an offering of love, or a gesture to silence me, to ease the guilt she must have felt for all the years of neglect? I opened the envelope, pulling out a check, a generous one, I noted. The numbers on it were substantial, far more than I had expected. It was money, yes, but the act of receiving it felt hollow. I couldn't help but wonder if it was a way to make up for all the years of unspoken favoritism. Was this her attempt to right a wrong? Or was it just another way for them to prove that Brian was always the better choice, the one deserving of praise and opportunities, while I was left with nothing but scraps? Brian noticed the exchange, his eyes narrowing for a split second before his grin returned. "What's this?" "A little something for the invisible one," he teased, his voice light, but the undercurrent of something darker flickered in his tone. It wasn't said with the playful intent he tried to make it sound like. I could feel the weight of his words, the subtle jab, and the sting of being reminded that I was never quite good enough. I didn't expect anything, I replied, my voice colder than I meant it to be. But thanks, I guess. The room fell quiet for a moment, the tension hanging between us. I looked at my parents, their faces frozen in place, unsure how to react. They must have known. They had to know what was happening beneath the surface. But still, they said nothing. And that's when I realized, no matter what they gave me, no matter how much money they handed me or how many gifts they offered, it would never fill the emptiness inside. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the material things. It was about the love and the attention that had always been reserved for Brian. I wasn't just invisible. I was expendable. And in that moment, I made a decision. The next time I had the chance, I wasn't going to sit quietly and fade into the background. I wasn't going to play the part of the invisible one anymore. It was time for something to change. The next few weeks were nothing short of suffocating. I tried to brush off the awkwardness of the dinner, but it lingered in my mind like a shadow that wouldn't let me breathe. Every time I saw Brian's smug grin or heard my parents' excessive praise for him, it was as if I was being suffocated by the invisible weight of their favoritism. My childhood role was no longer a distant memory, it had become my present reality, and I couldn't shake it. Brian, ever the star of the show, continued to bask in the spotlight. Every achievement, no matter how small, seemed to warrant a celebration. And there I was, stuck on the sidelines, trying not to let the bitterness rise like bile in my throat. It was becoming harder to pretend it didn't bother me. The casual superiority in his voice when he spoke about his accomplishments made my blood run cold. There was no acknowledgement of how hard I had worked, no recognition for the steps I had taken to build my life, my career, my independence. I remember the last time I visited my parents. It was a Friday evening, the kind where they usually invited us over for dinner to catch up. I hadn't been there in a while, weeks, maybe. I had been avoiding the house, avoiding the strain of pretending everything was fine. But today, I told myself, I was going to make an effort. I had to. I couldn't let my resentment control me, or so I thought. When I arrived, I was greeted with the usual warm smile from my mother. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, but the moment I stepped into the living room, I saw Brian sitting on the couch, his arm casually draped over the back. His eyes flicked to me, that familiar smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't say anything, but his presence in the room was enough to make the walls close in. "Oh, Jake, it's so nice to see you," my mother said, pulling me into a tight hug. I tried to smile, but the pit in my stomach told me everything I needed to know. Brian had already taken his spot in the family's world. He was the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. And I was the one who had to fight for attention, for validation, for scraps of affection. We sat down for dinner, and as expected, Brian did most of the talking. He regaled us with tales of his latest business deal, his recent trip to Europe, and the new luxury car he'd just bought. My mother hung on every word, nodding enthusiastically, and my father chimed in with the occasional "That's incredible" or "I'm proud of you, son." Meanwhile, I sat there, pushing my food around on my plate, feeling the isolation grow between us. I didn't want to be resentful, but it was hard not to be. I had worked my ass off for years, carving out a career I was proud of, yet here I was, being made to feel like I was invisible, like I didn't matter in comparison to Brian's endless list of achievements. After dinner, as we were sitting in the living room, my mother suddenly turned to me. "Jake, honey, we've been talking," she began, her tone soft and cautious, like she was walking on eggshells. "We're concerned about how you've been lately. You don't come around much, and we miss seeing you. Is everything okay?" The words felt rehearsed, like they were pulled from some kind of script she'd written in her mind to make herself feel better. I looked at her, studying her face, and I realized just how much she was avoiding. This wasn't concern for me. This was concern for the guilt she was feeling. The guilt of knowing that she had always treated me as the second choice, as the backup. Now, After years of neglect, she was trying to patch things up with a simple conversation. "I'm fine, Mom," I replied, my voice barely audible. "I've just been busy, you know? Life gets in the way sometimes." But that wasn't the real reason, was it? The truth was, every time I walked through their door, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of the years of favoritism, the years of being ignored. It was a constant reminder of my place in the family, second best, always. I couldn't be the son they wanted. I couldn't be the one who was easy to love, the one who made life simple for them. I had to carve out my own space in the world, and that had been a lonely, painful journey. Brian, sensing the tension, finally spoke. "Hey, Jake, how's that project you've been working on going? Still doing that little side business?" His voice was casual, but I could hear the undertone, the subtle dig that made it clear he thought my projects were small potatoes compared to his world. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, to make him understand how suffocating it was, how tired I was of constantly being compared to him. But the words stuck in my throat, tangled up with all the bitterness and resentment I had carefully buried over the years. "I'm doing fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just keeping busy." There it was again, the familiar cycle. Brian would shine. My parents would heap praise on him, ignoring the fact that I had my own struggles, my own victories, my own life. And I would fade into the background, playing the role of the invisible one. The backup. The second choice. As the evening wore on, I could feel the space between us growing wider. Every word, every glance, every smile from my parents felt like a reminder that I was never going to be the one they were most proud of. The growing divide between Brian and me wasn't just a matter of achievements or material success, it was about love, about attention, about the deep-seated sense that, no matter how hard I tried, I would always be in his shadow. And that realization, more than anything else, was what hurt the most. It all came to a head on a night that seemed like any other. But somehow, everything felt charged, like the universe had been quietly building up this moment for years, and tonight, it was all going to spill over. I had been avoiding Brian's calls for a while. Every time I saw his name on my phone screen, I felt that tightness in my chest, that familiar tension of wanting to answer but knowing it was only going to lead to another conversation where I felt like a second-class citizen. But tonight, the dam finally broke. My frustration, my anger, all the years of feeling like I was living in Brian's shadow, suddenly erupted. It was a Wednesday evening. I had planned on spending the night by myself, reading, zoning out to some music, anything to get my mind off the mess that was my family dynamic. But then, out of nowhere, Brian sent a text. "Hey, Jake. We need to talk." That was all it said. A simple sentence that carried more weight than it seemed. I knew this conversation had been coming. In fact, I had been dreading it for months. Brian had always had this way of making everything feel like a performance, always expecting my full attention, always treating me like a backdrop to his life. But now, I was done playing that role. I didn't wait. I called him back, my thumb tapping against the screen in a sudden rush of adrenaline. The phone rang for a few seconds before he picked up, his voice casual, but there was something beneath it. Something that told me this was going to be the moment where everything exploded. "Hey, Jake," he greeted me, sounding almost too calm. "You good?" I didn't answer right away. The words, the feelings, everything had been bottled up for so long, and now, I was afraid if I didn't say something, I'd explode. "You want to talk?" I finally said, my voice barely audible. "Well, I have something to say." I could hear Brian pause on the other end. He knew something was coming, and I could almost hear the calculation in his silence. "Okay, what's up?" he asked. It was his usual tone, polite, neutral, like he was already trying to manage whatever storm was brewing on my end. But I wasn't going to let him manage this. Not anymore. "Do you have any idea what it's like to live in your shadow, Brian?" The question came out more sharply than I intended, the words cutting through the air between us like daggers. "You're always the golden boy, Always the one who gets the praise, the attention, the love, and I'm just the guy who's always second. Do you even see it? I could hear the shift in his breathing. He wasn't expecting this. Jake, man, I didn't think, he started, but I wasn't having it. My voice rose, carrying the weight of years of frustration. Don't act like this isn't what's been happening all along. I've worked my ass off, too. But you get everything. The family's attention. Mom and Dad, they hang on every word you say. But me? I'm just there. Like I'm invisible. Like I don't matter. Brian's voice grew more defensive. That's not fair, Jake. I don't control what they do, okay? I'm just living my life. You're just living your life while I'm stuck trying to fight for scraps of recognition. I nearly shouted, the words spilling out faster than I could stop them. Do you have any idea how much it hurts? How alone I feel in this family. I've spent so many years feeling like I don't even belong. I work harder, I try harder, and yet I'm always just a footnote in the story of your success. There was a long silence on the other end. Brian didn't know how to respond. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head, trying to make sense of what I was saying. But there was no easy way out of this. There never was. Jake, I didn't mean to make you feel like that. I didn't know you felt so left out, he said slowly, as if testing each word. I thought you were okay. You're not the one who needs that kind of validation from them. You've always been so independent, always the strong one. That was it. The words that always haunted me. The idea that I was supposed to be okay, that I was supposed to handle it all on my own, while Brian got the attention for being the one who needed help. The independent son, the one who didn't cry for help, the one who didn't make waves. But that didn't mean I didn't need anything. I wasn't invincible. I wasn't some robot designed to carry the weight of everything on my own. I am independent, Brian, I said, the pain in my voice cutting through the walls of our conversation. But that doesn't mean I don't need a little recognition, too. That I don't need to feel like I matter. I need to feel like I'm worth something. To them. To you. There was another long pause, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant. I never knew you felt like that, he said, his tone softer now, as if a switch had been flipped. I swear, I didn't know. I didn't realize. That was it. The moment where I knew things had changed. For years, I had been invisible, but now, for the first time, Brian was seeing me. Not as the backup. Not as the second choice. But as someone who had his own pain, his own need for recognition. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this battle. The days after the confrontation were strange. It felt like the air between Brian and me was charged with the weight of everything unsaid for years, yet there was something different now. Something raw. It wasn't fixed, not by a long shot, but it felt like a crack had opened in the wall between us, letting in a little bit of light. It wasn't like the next day Brian called to apologize or shower me with attention. Things weren't magically healed. But when I saw him a few days later at Mom's house for Sunday dinner, he looked at me differently. The usual casual glance he would throw my way, sometimes dismissive, sometimes distracted, was replaced with something more intentional. It wasn't pity. It wasn't forced. But there was a level of awareness in his eyes. Maybe even regret. Mom had cooked one of her infamous roasts, the kind that brought everyone to the table even when it felt like the world outside was falling apart. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air, and the family was all gathered in the kitchen, chattering like it was just another normal Sunday. But there was an undercurrent now, something that vibrated beneath the surface. I could feel it in the way Brian caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod, like acknowledging me for the first time as someone more than just Jake. I didn't know how to process it yet. It wasn't enough. It didn't erase the years of feeling overlooked or left out, but it was something. Something that felt different from the usual empty attempts at reconciliation. It felt like we were both looking at each other through a new lens. Maybe the road ahead was still messy, but I wasn't as alone on it anymore. We didn't talk much that evening. But the dynamic had shifted. The tension that had once been so thick you could cut it with a knife wasn't gone, but it had softened. I could tell that, in his own way, Brian was trying. He kept glancing at me, watching, as though waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge that things were different now. I couldn't do that right away. I wasn't ready to pretend like everything was okay. I needed more than just a silent nod or a momentary glance. I needed action. But at least I could see the effort. I could see the cracks in the armor he'd built around himself, the same armor that had always kept me in the background. It wasn't fixed, but it was a start. The next few weeks were full of small moments, conversations that didn't feel rehearsed, gestures that weren't born out of obligation. Brian reached out more often, texting me randomly, asking if I wanted to grab coffee or go for a walk. At first, I kept my distance. The hurt was still too fresh. But then, one Saturday morning, I found myself texting him back. "Sure, let's do coffee." We sat at a small cafe downtown, each of us with a steaming cup of black coffee, the quiet between us feeling less awkward than I had imagined. He didn't jump right into any big conversation about our childhood or the past. Instead, we talked about simple things, the books we were reading, a new restaurant that had opened, the latest show we were watching. It was easy. More natural than I had expected. As though the space between us had shrunk by inches, even if the distance in our hearts was still there. And that's when I realized something important: this wasn't going to be an overnight fix. There wasn't a magic conversation that would make everything right. But the beginning of something was happening. For the first time in my life, it felt like Brian was willing to step up and see me as more than just the guy who faded into the background. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale resolution where everything magically worked out. But maybe that's what a path forward looks like: small steps, taken one at a time, with no clear end in sight. Maybe that's the way healing happens. Over the next few months, Brian and I continued to talk more, in ways that didn't feel forced or patronizing. We didn't dive into deep discussions about our childhood, but there was a new respect in the air between us. A mutual understanding, even if it wasn't fully articulated. I started to realize that this wasn't about Brian suddenly becoming my savior or me becoming the golden child. It was about breaking down the walls that had always kept us in these rigid roles, and allowing room for something more. The family dynamic, too, was slowly shifting. Mom seemed to notice the changes in how Brian and I interacted, and although she didn't say much, she started making space for me in ways that felt more inclusive. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like a start. As time passed, I learned that the most important thing wasn't the validation I had craved all those years. It was learning how to take up space on my own, without depending on anyone else to validate my worth. Maybe Brian and I would never be the closest of friends, but we were finally seeing each other for who we really were, not for the roles we had been forced into. And maybe, just maybe, that was the path forward, one where we could both exist in the family without fighting for the spotlight, learning to share the stage for the first time in our lives. It's funny how the smallest moments can shape the course of your life. Looking back now, months after that awkward Sunday dinner with Brian, I can see how much everything has changed, even if it didn't feel like it in the moment. For the first time, I don't feel like I'm living in the shadows of a role I never chose. I don't feel invisible anymore. It's strange how long I allowed myself to stay in that place, letting the weight of unspoken expectations mold me into someone I wasn't. It wasn't just about being the invisible one in comparison to Brian's status as the golden child. It was about letting those roles define how I saw myself, how I measured my worth. The truth was, I had allowed the distance between us to define our relationship for far too long, holding on to the idea that things would always be a certain way because they always had been. But after that first real conversation, that first crack in the walls, things have changed. Slowly, but surely, Brian and I have started building something more genuine between us, something less shaped by the outdated mold of favoritism and rivalry. It's not a perfect transformation, not some magical before and after moment, but it's real, and that's what matters. What I've come to realize is that healing isn't linear. There are still days when I feel the sting of the old dynamics, moments when Brian's easy smile and the effortless way he commands attention still hit me in ways I wish they didn't. But now, when those feelings crop up, I know what to do with them. I don't bottle them up, waiting for a confrontation to explode. I don't bury them in silence, letting them fester. Instead, I talk about them, sometimes with Brian, sometimes just to myself or with a trusted friend. And sometimes, I just sit with the discomfort and let it pass. What matters is that I don't let it control me the way it used to. I think Brian has changed too. I don't know exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the way, he started seeing me differently. Not as a problem to be solved, not as the person who's always lurking in the background, waiting for his approval, but as someone with my own life, my own struggles, and my own worth. He still doesn't understand everything I've been through, and I don't expect him to. But he's trying. And that, in itself, means more to me than any apology ever could. As for Mom, things have shifted there as well. I'm not sure if she's fully aware of how her actions affected me all these years, but I see her making small changes. She listens more now when I speak, as though she's finally acknowledging my voice, no longer just assuming I'll be okay in the background. It's not perfect, there are still moments when I feel like I'm competing for her attention, or when I'm reminded of the old ways. But there are also moments of real connection, moments where I feel truly seen. And that's enough for me. I think the biggest change of all, though, has been in my own sense of self. For years, I believed that in order to be valued, I had to fit into a role, either the quiet, invisible one or the loud, perfect one. But I've learned that I don't need to mold myself to any role at all. I'm enough as I am. I don't need anyone to define my worth. Not Brian, not Mom, not anyone. I get to decide who I am. The long-term impact of these changes hasn't been in the grand gestures or the perfect resolutions. It's in the small, everyday shifts, the way I show up for myself now, the way I take up space in the family without apologizing for it. It's in how Brian and I can talk, not as competitors or strangers, but as two people who are finally seeing each other for who we are, flaws and all. I don't know where this journey will take me. I don't know if the healing will be complete. What I do know is that it's no longer about fighting for attention or validation. It's about learning how to coexist with the people I love, even if the path forward is messy and imperfect. But it's mine to walk. And for the first time in a long time, I'm walking it with my head held high.